that it's high time to start?
Yes, I think so. It's 3 minutes past time. I think it's fine.
Okay, so it's a great pleasure to have you, and thank you for joining us today. I hope that you all are doing well in this time of pandemic. And dear Professor Lamont, thank you for acceptance of our invitation. My name is Piotr Kulas, and I am a sociologist and historian of ideas from Artes Liberales faculty and from University of Warsaw. And I'm going to introduce you. Uh, Professor Lamont, you have to know that you are quite renowned among Polish sociologists. However, beforehand, I would like to give some organizational information. Firstly, today's lecture is divided into two parts. In the first part, Professor Lamont will talk for approximately 45 minutes, and then there are 45 minutes left for a discussion. I know that you are quite happy to hear some comments and questions, both about your work and about the lecture that is going to be delivered. And we encourage all participants to take part in this second part of this presentation and in this discussion. And the best way is to do so is to put some comments or questions in chat. However, if anyone would like to ask questions personally, he or she can also do it by raising his or her hand, or by simply putting this will in chat. Okay, so Professor Michèle Lamont is professor of sociology and of African and African American studies, and Robert Goldman Professor of European Studies at Harvard University. She served as 108th president of the American Sociological Association in 2016, 2017, and she chaired the Council for European Studies from 2006 to 2009. She's also the recipient of John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, Gutenberg Research Award, and Erasmus Prize for her contribution to the social science in Europe and the rest of the world. She's also the recipient of honorary doctorates from 5 countries: Canada, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the UK. A cultural and comparative sociologist, Professor Lamont is the author or co-author of a dozen books and edited volumes and over 100 articles and chapters on a range of topics, including culture, inequality, racism and stigma, academia and knowledge, social change and successful societies, and also qualitative methods. Her most recent publications include the book Getting Respect, Responding to Stigma and Discrimination in the United States, Brazil, and Israel, and it was published by Princeton University Press in 2016, and a special issue of Daedalus on equality as a multidimensional process, co-edited with Paul Pearson, that was published in 2019. Professor Lamont is a director of the Waterhead Center for International Affairs, Harvard University, and Andrew Carnegie Fellow for 2019 to 2021. And the last year, she spent her sabbatical at the Russell Sage Foundation. Nowadays, she's working on a book on social change and repertoires of hope to be published by Simon & Schuster in a due time, I think. And as for me, I especially like your work on resilience and on upper middle class in the United States and France. And in 2017, you delivered an address, a presidential address, as a president of American Sociological Association, entitled Addressing Recognition Gaps, the Stigmatization and the Reduction of Inequality. And it was, as I said before starting this panel, this lecture was a great inspiration for our conference. Today's lecture is entitled New Engines of Hope After the American Dream, Finding Recognition in the New Gilded Age. And if you allow me for my comment, I think that many people hope that the next generation is about to save the world somehow. And Gen Z generation Z is of great importance here, is considered as a great player in this context. By the way, I would like to know that in Polish historical and sociological context, the category of generation is very, very important. So we are really grateful for this team. It is because our history and Polish sociologists and historians believe that looking through generational glass can give us some kind of potential to interpret social change at key historical moments. So let me say again that it's a great pleasure to have you at our conference. Unfortunately, we cannot meet in Warsaw and you cannot see our university, but I think that we can make something about it in the future. Professor Michèle Lamont, the Zoom is yours, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, dear colleagues. Thank you for inviting me. I mean, I'm so sorry that I'm not actually able to be with you to have a whole conference devoted to the topic of recognition gap. I would have loved to be with you and to learn from your work. I like the fact that the sessions are organized around an interdisciplinary framework. I read the abstract and it just looks fantastic. Unfortunately, here in Boston, life continues and I have to teach and I have to do my usual responsibilities. So I cannot just take off and be with you for the next 2 days. But I look forward to your reactions to the talk and also if there are topics that we don't have time to discuss, because I will have to leave you in, at 6 p.m. your time, I think, sharp, but 1 p.m. my time. You can certainly email me to take on some topics. So thank you again. So here I'm going to share the screen. And the talk I'm going to be presenting is about this book that I've been working on, which Piotr mentioned, and it's a book for a large audience. It's the first time that I write a trade book. So you will see that I will lace my presentation with references to my scholarly work. And it's a little bit like self-centered. I'm not discussing the work of many other important scholars who have worked on recognition, in part because of the specific purpose of this book, that is, to reach a wider audience. But I will mention various publications that I have already put out there, which engages with the literature. And here I acknowledge the various funders that have contributed to making this research possible. So the study is basically organized in two parts. The first part offers a diagnosis, which is about the current crisis that American society is facing at the time of, after several decades of growing inequality, which has now been brought to a new level by the impact of COVID, which has had such negative consequences for the lower half of the social ladder. And at the time when the American dream is simply not delivering anymore, and the society is facing the challenge of having to invent new collective myths, that and new visions of where we're going collectively, what will inspire people's hope moving forward. So the first part of the diagnosis is followed by a part where I discuss the solutions and the productions of new narratives of hope. And I'm doing this by looking specifically at those who produce the narratives, what I called agents of change. But I'm also looking at ordinary people. We did interviews with my graduate students, with Gen Zs, to see how they understand the path forward. And I'm interested particularly in how to bridge the recognition gap, how to create narratives that may allow a wide range of people to be viewed as worthy. So in the parlance of young Americans, the question is who's legit or who is respectable? And I'm focusing mostly on the progressive liberal end of the liberal spectrum, of the political spectrum. Of course, many people have argued that Trump's popularity is due to the fact that he's offering legitimacy to the downwardly mobile white working class. And I've written a paper that analyzes his electoral speeches, which shows exactly how he did that in terms of telling workers, it's not your fault, it's the fault of globalization. We know that you're hardworking people, and I'm going to defend you against immigrants. So, but this kind of, rhetoric of valorization is not part of this current study, although I will refer to it. The person with the white t-shirt there is a trans person, Zachary Drucker, who played a very important role in advising Netflix when it was producing a show called Transparent, which is a show that became very popular. It's the story of a middle-aged man, or actually he's 60, who decide that he wants to dress as a woman. He's trans, and he has to negotiate with his adult children how he's going to do this. And it's a show that became very important in helping people understand what is the internal life of a trans person, and his quest for recognition became visible. And I'm presenting to you this person, Zachary Drucker, who wears this t-shirt that says, "I see you," and always in all ways. And this is a very crucial message in the current politics of recognition. The word "I see you" is very central to the language that is used by Gen Zs and millennials to express their own quest for recognition, but also the quest of others. On the other side, you have this t-shirt that is also a poster that you find on many people's lawns, along with the Black Lives Matter t-shirt. And this is also affirming the importance of, no human is illegal, of expressing solidarity with undocumented immigrants and others. And that poster became very widely available after Trump banned Muslim travel, travel in 7 Muslim countries. It was his first executive order in February of 2000. And the popularity of such, statements really exemplify the ways in which claims about recognition and a desire to foster recognition at large has become so central in the politics, the identity politics of the contemporary US. And the last line, "kindness is everything," is crucial. This is where the personal becomes, political. Being nice, being kind to other human beings becomes a political act. And it means also not taking, there was just a number of Asian Americans who were killed in Atlanta, taking strong stance against the xenophobia that has been part of American society forever. So this illustrates the empirical focus of the study. And I'm going to draw on this book that Piotr mentioned, Social Resilience in the Neoliberal Era, which very much offers a way of approaching social resilience, which is at odds with the huge and growing literature on individual grit. The literature in happiness studies that the positive psychology has produced is all about encouraging people to pull themselves by their bootstraps. And instead, in this book, we look at how institutions and cultural repertoires, the societies that we engineer, are going to give us the resources that we need for a larger number of people to become recognized, to gain legitimacy. And one example is the adoption of same-sex marriage law in a number of states went hand in hand with a decline in the number of suicide among LGBTQ youth. So this is a case where the law sends people a message about their legitimacy in society, which translates directly in better subjective well-being. So this is to say that recognition matters in terms as important as mental health. It matters. I'll come back to this. So the study draws on over 160 interviews, which what I called agents of change, people who work in the entertainment industry, people who are in stand-up comedy, in the narrative change industry, people who specialize in engineering changes in how we perceive reality. So the Gates Foundation, for instance, has invested tons of money to transform how Americans perceive the poor, to have view the low-income population as people who are victim of structural change, as opposed to lazy people who are not self-reliant. So I also draw on interviews with Gen Zs, people born after 2000, and who are, when we look at the statistics on the impact of COVID on the mental health of people, this is the generation that is suffering the most currently. And these interviews were conducted by my graduate students who are themselves Gen Zs. One of them worked in advertising for several years, so she's more like a millennial. But we interviewed them both last fall and also last summer during the hot summer where people fought and mobilized around the question of racial justice. I'll come back to that. And finally, there were interviews, people I re-interviewed from our previous project to look at how middle class and working class African Americans understand the changing meaning of the American dream. So the key concept is the concept of recognition. You're all very familiar with it. I draw here on Axel Honneth. I'm not going to spend more time on this, but I look at it hand in hand with the concept of stigmatization, which is, the fact of being qualified negatively. So I'm interested in how groups, the transformation of frames through which groups go from being stigmatized to being recognized. And the goal is to look at the transformation of cultural membership, the process by which social actors understand themselves as similar or different from others, and the obligations that come with it, for instance, in terms of welfare support. So the question is, how can we broaden cultural membership so that it includes the widest number of people possible? And I studied this as part of a cultural process of redefinition. These cultural process also includes rationalization, identification, legitimation. The paper that is mentioned here offers a theoretical framework for the study of cultural process as it unfolds through everyday interactions. So this process of intersubjective meaning making, I argue, is very central to the study of inequality and has been neglected. In the American context, at least, the literature is very much focused on, neighborhood effects. That's typically the kind of mechanism that people look at. Well, I argue that these cultural processes are equally central and not studied systematically from an empirical perspective, which I know is one of the motivation of your conference. And I also argue that recognition is really important. I also already mentioned how the stigmatization of LGBTQ leads to suicide. There's many other areas of research that are extremely well developed that show the same kind of relationship. For instance, how experience of racism are affecting directly the health of African Americans. We know that experiencing poverty is also, for instance, think of LGBTQ youth that are being kicked out of the house by the parents who cannot accept their sexual orientation. Well, that's a case where stigmatization leads to poverty. So we need to rethink, a kind of base superstructure approach to culture, because this is a case where the social definition of certain attributes lead directly to poverty. So what's behind this is a complexification, if you will, of how we think about the relationship between material resources and cultural definitions. So as Piotr mentioned, I'm building on this paper that I gave as president of the essay addressing the recognition gap, and also an annual lecture I gave to the British Journal of Sociology in 2018. And in both cases, it's really focused on studying these processes of cultural citizenship, broadening cultural citizenship. Okay, and I wrote a number of papers that, other papers that are feed into this, the project. So I'm just mentioning them to you here. Normally when I give this talk, I don't, because, but here, since you are public largely of sociologists, I thought I would. So it's, I'm building on this in various ways. So the summary part of the book focuses on this scripts of self, the neoliberal scripts of self that has diffused widely over the last 40 years progressively, with its focus on, when we think about, you can see here a graph showing the diffusion of the term neoliberalism over the last decades. And you see 1995 is a peak. And it's as present in Europe as it is in the US. And this corresponds, I would argue, with the transformations of scripts of self. So in the book Social Resilience in the Neoliberal Era, there's a first chapter by the historian Bill Sewell and the sociologist Peter Evans, who argue that the spread of neoliberalism is happening simultaneously at various levels. But the level I'm concerned with this project is the transformation of the scripts of self, the scripts or the frames through which people understand what is a legitimate self in the context of contemporary society. And I would argue that many of the virtues that are most valued, at least, in the last few years, are characterized by focus on self-reliance. One should carry one's own weight, not depend on the welfare state. So people like Ulrich Beck have written plenty on the privatization of risk as a characteristic of contemporary societies. And the pursuit of status, wealth, and consumption. So we measure our worth through socioeconomic success, and that goes hand in hand with an understanding of society where Darwinism, and competitiveness are valued, and meritocracy, the notion that individual determination to achieve success is also valued. So Trump is here in part because he incarnates many of these values, and this is the kind of scripts of self that brought him to power and probably brought many other European leaders to power. So I mentioned the term meritocracy. It's not exactly the same as the other virtues, but I'm mentioning it in part because we have data on the spread of belief in meritocracy over the last decades. You see here Poland, the fourth one on the fifth one on the second line, extremely between 1970 and 2010, very sharp increase in the extent to which people believe in meritocracy. And here you see the contrast between France, Germany, the UK, and the US. And you can see the US is the highest of all. And there's only, of those countries, 23 advanced industrial societies in the study. Belief in meritocracy has increased everywhere, but in 3 countries, Austria, Canada, and the US. So this is not exactly the same as measuring the spread of the neoliberal scripts of self, but it's certainly correlated with. So in the US, at the same time as this is happening, you have very well documented a decline in the possibility of upward mobility. Very influential study by Raj Chetty and co-author show that it will be impossible for young people today to reach the same social status as their parents. At the same time, many Americans continue to believe in the American dream, to think it's achievable, if not by everyone, at least by them. But at the same time, the concept is really losing its meaning. People put everything under it, such as having a good family. That's the American dream. So there's a real paradox between the destruction of the conditions that allowed Americans to be upwardly mobile after World War II, during the century of American exceptionalism, if you will, and the fact that these conditions are being destroyed at the same time as people are continuing to invest in it. And the faith in the American dream as a symbol of cultural citizenship has brought to our shore over centuries immigrants. People come here because they believe that one can, through material success, gain cultural citizenship. Even African Americans believe that. So it's quite different from, let's say, the approach to citizenship based in ethnicity that Brubaker had documented for Germany, for instance. So I think this American dream is very pernicious because it's in some ways schizophrenic. It feeds what I view as a cultural polarization. In fact, those who are viewed as most successful are those who achieve socioeconomic success and self-reliance, typically the upper middle class, people like us, college-educated professionals and managers. And for the working class and for the poor, they're always viewed as not successful, stigmatized at the margin. And as this neoliberal scripts of selves become more hegemonic, it's becoming less and less possible for these people in the lower half of the social ladder to feel worthy. And that's exactly what has been viewed as, feeding the popularity of Trump and the far right. So you have a class bifurcation in this recognition gap, which is also feeding, the growing stigmatization of groups that are not associated with upper middle class success, Blacks in particular. So, and this is fed by what's diffused on in entertainment television, where the vast majority of the characters are professionals and managers. And when you do find working class people being represented, they tend to be represented as incompetent, immature, ignorant. So think about Bart Simpson, for instance. So they are typically the object of ridicule. So it's very difficult for workers to find representations of themselves in the popular media, which would recognize their dignity and their value as human beings. So this feeds a huge mental health crisis. We know that there's a big mental health crisis even among the winners of the system, the upper middle class, who are mostly attributing this to the focus on money and work, especially since 2008, since the recession of 2008. The middle class has become obsessed with downward mobility, and people have been working harder, being more and more focused on making sure that their kids are not downwardly mobile. And it's paradoxical that even the winners of the system find themselves facing more depression and more stress given the current situation, which has certainly been aggravated by COVID, the economic crisis that have come with COVID. And when we look at data on the mental health of young people, there's been also a huge increase. We know, for instance, in the universities, we're now spending an extreme amount of energy and time making sure that the mental health of our students is not, totally dipping down. It's been extremely challenging for everyone. So there's plenty of data showing that younger people are facing major mental health challenges. So the second part is really about how do we address the problem. There's many ways of addressing the problem. I'm not denying the importance of redistributing resources to the lower half of the social ladder. Redistribution is certainly crucial, but since I'm a cultural sociologist, I'm also mostly concerned with the creation of solutions, cultural solutions. And I argue that what we need to do is also produce, in addition to redistributing, we need to produce new narratives, narratives that could act as sources of hope, that would help us make it possible or easier for people who do not meet this, neoliberal scripts of self to also feel as that they are worthy. So I set to look at the world of cultural production and see where are alternative messages coming from and what are the alternative dreams that are, or sources of hope that are now being offered to the American population. Who produces these and how do they frame who's worthy? And I will argue that what we see is the emergence of much more pluralistic criteria of worth, that not only people who are economically successful are now celebrated as worthy. There's also an emphasis on what I call everyday cosmopolitanism, the fact that we should all be valuable from the simple fact of being human beings, so a celebration of inclusion of all human beings. And I'm also looking closely at how groups are becoming destigmatized as this process of also removing the stigma from those who are viewed as low status. So these are the cultural processes that are at the center of my book. And in order to do this, I draw on recent publications that have aimed to update Habermas's concept of the public sphere in the 21st century with a focus on the major changes that have happened, such as the development of a vast industry of new media and technologies of communication. and the role of hybrid institutions, think tanks, foundation that are specializing in the transformation of narratives. So I cite here two of the recent articles that I think are particularly excellent at helping us, at giving us the tools that we need in order to understand how new cultural repertoires become institutionalized and sustain the kind of changes that I will be describing. So we can think of the contemporary public sphere as being made of various fields, kind of Bourdieusian fields, that are partly overlapping. So here I have listed what I view as the main milieu, which are producing these new repertoires of hopes, the one that I'm going to be focusing on. So I was able to interview over 160 people working in a number of spheres. Probably many of these names will not say anything to you, but I'll just mention a few just so you get a little bit of an idea. Probably some of them will. So Barbara Stanley, missionary sister of the Sacred Heart. She's the sister general in charge of the whole network. There's something like 250 of these sisters alive, but they control millions and millions and millions. And they are very much engaged in the diffusion of the values of everyday cosmopolitanism and charity. And they operate at the planetary level. And people like the first person listed, very much involved in the mobilization for racial justice with African Americans, but with in the background more of a religious framework. You have people like my colleague, Henry Louis Gates, who has been at the center of the transformation of the canon, the literary canon in the US, and who's been, just 2 weeks ago, he published a new book on the role of the Black church in mobilizing for racial justice. I'm going to come back in a second on to the artist. But, you know, stand-up comics is exploding. I don't know if you probably have access to Netflix in Poland. It's just, you know, they have an infinite number of specials that feature stand-up comics, and many of them are people of color. So we've done interviews altogether with 75 stand-up comedians and people working in Hollywood who are creating new narratives. So the Hollywood people, for instance, you may be popular with Queer Eye or the show the Handmaid's Tale. So we interviewed the creatives behind these shows, people who create the scenarios, and ask them specifically about the ways in which the shows that they create may contribute to the transformation of the cultural structures through which we perceive reality. You have there in red the name Channing Dungey at Netflix, who's in charge of programmation at the global level. So she's influencing probably what is shown on Netflix in Africa and in Europe. And she's very, very close to people. I don't know if the names will be familiar to you, but Ava DuVernay or Shonda Rhimes, who are, you know, very important powerhouse, extremely powerful African-American women who have produced shows such as Black Panther. So many of these shows are celebrating diversity in one way or the other. So I could go on here. You know, you have leaders in the field of social policy. Heather Boucher is on Biden's Council of Economic Advisor. And these people are all pushing for a revitalized capitalism, so inclusive capitalism. They believe that a capitalism that is redistributing better the sources of wealth is what we need. So you have the growing influence of the socialist renewal. If you're not familiar with Jacobin or the podcast Chapo Trap House, you should really check it out, because that's the Democratic Socialist of America have gained enormous influence over the last 5 years, as shown, for instance, by the electoral success of Sanders. And these are the publications that are behind. So this renewal of the socialist agenda has been extremely important and lively. And there's been this huge movement about incarceration, which I'm also tapping into. So I don't have time to describe all of this to you, but there's also the traditional advocacy and movement against incarceration, immigration, labor, poverty, the usual social social issues that the left has focused on. So to give you a better understanding of the kind of recognition gap that I'm concerned with, I'll talk to you a little bit about a set of interviews that I've conducted with people in the visual arts, basically mostly Black and queer photographers, who are all preoccupied with providing new depiction of these stigmatized population. So why not interview them about what they're trying to do in their work? They emphasize the production of what they view as three-dimensional depiction of members of these stigmatized group that will reveal their humanity instead of offering caricatural views of who these people are, that will make them visible when these are groups that are typically not seen, or if they are seen, they're ridiculed, that will present them the way that they want to be seen, okay, with dignity. So I know that in some Eastern Europe countries, there's a lot of stigmatization of queer people. So I don't know your national context that well, but I find it very interesting that now there's this huge movement in the American context, at least, to present queer people through such positive frameworks. And I'm not sure what it looks like in a society where this is not happening. I know that the anti-queer movements in Africa, for instance, are just extremely strong. So it's quite, I don't know, maybe it's similar in Poland, I think might be. But these artists are producing through their work that becomes very widely available counter frames. So when I interviewed Catherine Opie, who is a queer photographer, about the work that she does with the queer community in LA, she uses terms like, I want to represent the familial intimacy, the closeness that members of this community feel toward each other, to really represent them, she says, representing us with love and dignity. So what's one thing that's distinctive about her is that she's in the S&M community of LA, the leather community. And about this community, she says, we're typically represented as child molesters and everything that's attached to this. So instead of representing us with the leather and all, instead of showing tattoos and piercing and the markings on the body, I wanted to do a series of the portrait that were incredibly noble. So you can see the language that she uses to describe her own work, which is really a language of, giving recognition. So another project by the artist Hank Willis Thomas concerns African-American men. So he went around 12 different cities with video, so it's a video project, and he interviewed them with the question, what does it mean to you to be a Black man? And then the art piece itself is the interviews with these guys. And what does he take away from the experience? He says that what we find mostly is that this group is extremely huge diversity. And there's the idea of a Black man identity is a figment of European imagination. In fact, what we have most common among us is the fact that we all face this prejudgment that people place upon us. What brings us together is the stereotype and the racism that we're encountering. So this project became particularly important because it was used as a teaching tool, not an explicit teaching tool, but it was simply presented in many, many museums and in schools. And it was used for community engagement to generate conversation around the Black men. And sorry, I need to turn this off. So if you want to see the video, you can simply Google question bridge and you will see it. You can hear these men speak and see what they say about themselves. How was he able to achieve this? He worked jointly with a philanthropy called the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, which I interviewed Sean Dove, the leader of this organization, which was funded by the Open Society Foundation, and it has grown enormously. It now has 2,600 organizations nationwide, and they have they were behind this program, My Brother's Keeper, that Obama pushed a lot. But what this leader of the organization says is that we're working on language and narratives. They're very, very purposeful about the transformation of narratives about the Black men. Instead of presenting them as problems, he says, instead of having them identified with poverty or the face of crime, instead we're trying to define Black men by their aspiration to move away from the problem frame. So what's really surprised me as I was doing this project is how deeply attuned so many of these organizations are aware that narratives exist and that they can be changed. And there's a huge number of organizations that are specializing in the transformation of frames, and they are receiving money from foundation to promote different frames. So more in common, swayable, purpose, and there's an enormous amount of energy invested into testing what different frames might do. So do we frame, for instance, immigrants as people who just want to come to the US to take advantage of the welfare? Someone was describing to in an interview I was working on yesterday how they have identified the best frame possible for immigrants as asking, working class men who are often very xenophobic, asking them, well, they just want to save their kids, what would you do if you were them? They want to put their kids in a safe place. That's why they moved to the US. What would you do if you were in their shoes? So the idea is to appeal to shared humanity of, the parent who wants to have their kids in a safe space. And they know through testing using experiments that this frame is correlated with a decline in xenophobic attitudes. So it's lots of testing and often using technology and there's the explosion of a field that is mobilizing the social media also to transform attitudes. So that's an important transformation that will be part of the book. But one of the key argument here is that what we have is what I call recognition chains, a little bit drawing on the work of Bruno Latour, the idea of collaboration between the cultural producers who are offering these new cultural scripts through which stigmatized groups can be perceived, and then the funders that are providing means to scale up. Everyone's talking about scaling up and diffuse and broaden the diffusion of these narratives. So it's the Ford Foundation has been a very powerful force behind this, and they have created a lot of these organizations, and they talk explicitly about capturing hearts and minds. This is very important because the world of social change in the US until 10 years ago or so, I think, was monopolized largely by economists. It was all about distributing resources. And now you have cultural entrepreneurship that has become extremely central and, promoted by progressive organizations. Now, many people will be skeptical about how progressive the Ford Foundation has been. It doesn't have a perfect history in terms of its involvement in, Latin America, for instance. But currently, the current leadership is very progressive, and that's what they're doing. So we're also now in the process of broadening the study. As I'm writing the book, I'm also collaborating with several graduate students on various papers that explore in greater depth some of the data. So one of the paper, for instance, concerns specifically the stand-up comics and Hollywood creatives, and we've identified six different strategies that they're using in their work to promote recognition. So the Trojan horse is very much about, sneaking in pro-inclusion discourse in their shows, but they say that if I'm too much in the face of people with my pro-inclusion themes, it's not going to work. People are not going to laugh. So you have to do it very subtly to appeal to people. So the narrative, the question of engaging the audience and getting them, lost in the narrative is always primary. First, you have to get people to to laugh. You cannot force them to drink the Kool-Aid. So the presentation of the message has to be adapted to the medium. And this particular paper we're working on has to do with the level of autonomy that stand-up comics have, which is much greater than what the Hollywood creatives can do, and how their autonomy goes hand in hand with very different strategies of recognition than is the case for people who work in Hollywood, where the division of labor is very high. So finally, in the few minutes that are left, I'm going to talk to you about the Gen Zs. I forgot to present this. So this is simply my conclusion for the general introduction, to say, after last summer, the movement for racial justice, you've had a very important movement of cohort replacement in cultural industries. To give you one example, the Poetry Foundation in Chicago, which is one of the most important foundation, the most important foundation supporting poetry. The president was a former president of Northwestern University, a white man, Jewish, progressive, well, liberal at least. And he was forced to step down because a number of younger poets of color denounced him as, not being open to diversity. So this is something that happened in a large number of cultural industries, head of museums. There's been, following last summer, a massive cohort replacement across many cultural institutions. So with putting at the center of it a new agenda for offering cultural, products that reflect the diversity of American society. And several of the main foundations have made a very public commitment in focusing their funding for the next 4 years on social and racial justice. So it's a little bit like a moment of reckoning, where the country is saying, we have really sinned by omission, and now we need to invest to allow the expression of the cultural richness of the diversity of American society to be expressed. So that's how the recognition gap is presenting itself now. And one of the ideas that my book will be pushing is the idea that the American dream is being replaced by a kind of new agenda for what brings us together, which is a country where inclusion is valued. And it's not on, and that value, not only inclusion, but also authenticity, sustainability, themes that are very dear to the Gen Zs. And this happens at the same time as you have a movement toward the celebration of a plurality of criteria of worth, which you see also in the process of destigmatization, which I have studied in this paper that is mentioned at the bottom of this slide, by comparing people with HIV/AIDS, African Americans, and people who are obese. And with my collaborators, we did a very detailed analysis of case studies of, whether and how obesity, for instance, was able to become destigmatized. The book by Abigail Sagi, What's Wrong is Fat, tells this story. We use a book by Steve Epstein on HIV/AIDS to see exactly what happened. And we distill their various findings into this kind of model, where the destigmatization of groups results from the mobilization of social actors, which are typically a mix of cultural producers of the types that I have interviewed, with social movements. So there's collaboration involved, but they are drawing on the cultural resources that are available in the environment to engage in destigmatizing action. So which results in the destigmatization of groups. So what we found in this particular project, as you can see here, is that, HIV/AIDS was extremely successful over the last 20 years. I remember when the AIDS crisis started in 1980, I lived in Stanford, California at the time. Everyone was freaked out. People thought that you could, basically get AIDS by, touching a handle that had been touched by someone who had AIDS. And then eventually much more knowledge was gained about the mechanism of transmission, and it became to be separated from the idea that gay people are too liberal sexually. So the demoralization of AIDS became very important. But this did not happen with obesity, where people who are obese are still viewed as lazy and lacking of self-control. So it's a group that remains extremely stigmatized in moral terms. So this paper tells this story, but what we're seeing right now with the body acceptance movement, which is gaining a lot of popularity, is maybe a transformation. People like Lizzo is carrying. Those of you who watch the Grammys on Sunday, I don't know if you're interested, but Megan Thee Stallion, these are all very large Black women, and they are affirming their body and proclaiming I'm beautiful. So they're really engaged in every second in this moment. In this show in 2020, Lizzo was surrounded by maybe like 25 very large African-American ballet dancers, which is in itself a big statement. So okay, so now finally turning to the papers that have to do with Gen Zs. Well, I'm working on two different papers with two graduate students about how the Gen Zs are producing recognition, how they are understanding the sources of their social resilience. And these two themes are very much connected with each other. So why Gen Zs? Well, it's a group you can see here that is gaining enormous attention. It's in the newspapers every day. It's a group that is also viewed as extremely agentic. It's everywhere. Sorry. It's everywhere in the media. And especially in the context of the mobilization of last summer. But at the same time, it's viewed as a generation that is very much, the victim of the current situation. They are at an age where they should be studying, should be, moving out of their parents' house, should be, finding jobs. Well, in terms of unemployment, they are extremely badly hit, and their future is extremely uncertain. So in terms of the literature on dealing with uncertainty, it's the perfect group. Even before the pandemic, it's a group that faced many challenges. They define themselves as doomers, that is, people who don't want children because they think that the economy, the planet is in the process of being destroyed. At the same time, they believe in political engagement, especially at the local level, which was not as much the case for the generation that preceded them, the millennials. And they are very, very engaged with sustainability. And the millennials had been hit by the 2008 recession, which had made them far more suspicious of collective engagement. Whereas the Gen Zs think basically my generation, the boomers, totally screwed up. So, and they say now we are in charge, we're in the cockpit now and we're going to change the world. So they were very much mobilized behind Sanders, and now Biden we just passed this huge package of redistribution, something that no one would imagine 10 years ago, the largest package of redistribution since in the history of the 20th century in the US, since the last one. So the emotional or the energy that they're bringing to American politics is absolutely crucial. So we did interviews. Shira and Mary did a lot of interviews with members of this group. Half of the sample is in the Midwest. The other half is in the Northeast, and they are college students. So it's largely a middle-class samples. Some of them are working class. I believe 13 out of the total sample are, and half of them are people of color, half of them are white. But the two papers on which we're working are mostly focusing on, are not focusing on differences within the groups. They're more focusing on the similarities among our respondents. So we've been concerned with the scripts of self and how they are changing. And we have argued in the paper that you have two dominant types of scripts of self. Since we interviewed them before the pandemic, and in the middle of the pandemic, we're able to see the ways in which the pandemic is changing their orientation. And we've asked them, what are the main tools that you have at your disposal to navigate these moments of uncertainty? And what you have under the three boxes there, collective identity, adaptation, it's basically what they tell us about the ways in which what they do to try to navigate the current situation. And you can see there are verbs, connecting, destigmatizing, including. And we argue that these various types of actions are feeding their social resilience. And a lot of it has to do with redefining their lives in a way that is also moving toward more recognition of a wider range of people and their engagement with the collectivity. So they say, for instance, there's a language of acceptance, of plurality of paths of life, that we should, we don't all have to play golf on Sunday morning or go to Christian church, a celebration of diversity, something like everyone is worthy. You should dedicate yourself to what you're passionate about. So the celebration of inclusion goes very deep for that generation. And they're also rejecting the idea that, only people who are doing well financially are worthy. The celebration of, we're all worthy because of our shared, of our moral character, a celebration of pluralism. I'm going a little bit faster here. The idea also that we all have a responsibility to get engaged with our society. So as a reaction to the summer, to COVID, they're revisiting their professional choices and saying we have to do things that help transform society because we're all in this together and we have no choice. And the conditions of social resilience that they are discussing have to do with disorientation toward the community. And so they want to push for a more inclusive future, essentially. And it's an activist generation that is working toward addressing social problems. And very quickly, the final paper is about, the literature on cultural repertoires. We're looking at the sources, the cultural tools on which they draw to make sense of their lives. And what we say is that they're still very much embracing aspects of the American dream, mostly having to do with hard work and entrepreneurialism, the idea that we should take our life in our hands. But at the same time, unlike their parents' generation, they value the therapeutic ethos, the notion that we should have a balanced life, we should not kill ourselves to work, and we should also think about our mental health and our well-being. So these four, and then ordinary cosmopolitanism, having to do with the notion that we're all valuable and worthy, and the cohort narrative, which has to do with, it's our task to change society and focus on collective goals. And they are able to bring these four themes together. That's basically what we see from their interview as they describe to us the kind of life that they want to have in the future and what are the tools that they have to do so. So here we do a detailed analysis of the interview to identify the elements of the traditional cultural repertoires they draw on, the maintained elements, which one they reject, and what are the most crucial themes in their current worldview. And as you can see here with the two themes that are highlighted in yellow, is the recognition of the plurality of life path, and also the notion that work should be based on moral character and communal participation and not only on the pursuit of money and consumption, with choosing career with an emphasis on social impact. So the worldview that they're offering is quite different. At the same time, the cancel culture is very central in this generation, and there's a lot, we argue, of implicit exclusion toward the working class who are forced to focus on their material goals because they don't have a choice. So they are quite blind to the ways in which, in fact, the cultural choices that they're making are in fact, biased in the favor of the working class. So as I'm finishing this book, I'm interested in looking at the production of this culture of diversity, and eventually also how it diffuses beyond the US, because as we saw with the aftermath of the mobilization against racial injustice this summer, which were the largest, mobilization in the history of the US ever, you've had a lot of, a trickle effect, lots of mobilization across cities in Europe as well. So I also want this story to be a story of transnational diffusion of social movement, and what are the implications of this analysis for what is ahead of us in terms of what's happening in North America, in Canada in particular. I'm Canadian, I know well what's happening there, but also in Europe and to some extent on other continents as well. So as I said earlier, this is a book in progress. These are the students who have been helping me with the project. This is very much, and I thank them. They're just an amazing team. And it is totally work in progress. So I'm very, very eager to hear from you and to get your suggestions as I am finishing this book. I'm not finishing, I still have probably 7 or 8 months of work ahead of me, but the book is also meant to be an international book. So I hope that it will be read in Europe. And I'm particularly eager to hear from you about, what are the topics that, you don't agree with, or you speak most to you. So, or any other question or comments you may have. So I'll stop here. And I look forward to the conversation.